Hello friends, my name is JJ, and it's time for a major update on Bill C-11, the Canadian government's big YouTube regulation bill that I have been yapping about for the better part of 2 years. As someone who has never liked this bill, this recent news is incredibly good and has made me the most optimistic I've been since... well, basically since this whole saga first started. But it is also an optimism that has little to do with anything that this government is affirmatively doing, and more a reflection of how sometimes government is so incompetent, it winds up working to your advantage. So allow me to quickly summarize the background of all of this for anyone who is just joining us now. Internet streaming content is unregulated in Canada. People can watch whatever they like, but the Trudeau administration thinks this is bad for patriotism. So they got the Parliament to pass a law called Bill C-11 that will force the streaming platforms to expose Canadian users to good Canadian content and thus improve nationalism. The end. In practice, this meant giving new powers to the organ of the Canadian federal government that regulates the media, the CRTC. Bill C-11 is written in quite broad and vague language, and accordingly outsources a lot of the actual hard work of achieving these goals to the people who run the CRTC. This is unto itself a major flaw with Bill C-11 in particular, but is also a revelation of deeper flaws within the Canadian political process in general these days. Modern Canadian politicians often cannot be bothered to write laws whose details match their ambitions, so they just dump those ambitions on the bureaucracy by giving them new powers, which means it is the bureaucrats who then wind up bearing the real-world responsibility for writing the precise rules that Canadians actually wind up living under. This is troubling to the extent it represents an abdication of democratic authority to unelected officials. But at the same time, Canadian bureaucracy can also be an incredibly slow-moving beast. Even if the politicians vote to give the bureaucrats sweeping new powers, there is no guarantee that they will use those powers in a rash or even efficient way. And thus, let us examine how the CRTC has chosen to implement Bill C-11. So back when C-11 was first passed by Parliament in the spring of 2023, the CRTC posted a little timeline on their website estimating how long they figured it would take to fully implement the Parliament's will. The CRTC is quite a large and complex bureaucracy, and as such, it has a fairly elaborate process for implementing new laws, especially when the law is vague to the point where the CRTC has to basically rewrite the entire thing in order to make it practically enforceable. On their original timeline, the CRTC outlined 3 phases: public hearings and consultations throughout the remainder of 2023 and much of 2024, followed by the drafting of actionable policies in the fall of 24, with the end goal of full implementation of Bill C-11 before 2025. And at first, it seemed like they were following this schedule relatively well. Consultations began last May, and the CRTC board heard from hundreds of interested witnesses from all across Canada testifying about their opinions on Bill C-11, including me, who testified last December. But you know, even at the time, I remember feeling like the CRTC was only beginning to scratch the surface of everything that Bill C-11 aspired to do. Something I have historically underestimated in my C-11 commentary is the degree that a lot of people consider Bill C-11 to be primarily a money thing. Which is to say, even though the bill has a lot of dramatic ambitions to change the sort of content that Canadians watch on streaming platforms, it also seeks to redistribute wealth between the big streaming platforms, which are of course very successful and have a lot of money, and various less successful players in the Canadian media industry, like struggling TV channels and radio stations. Following those initial hearings, the CRTC has now introduced a new system wherein streaming platforms that operate in Canada have to pay new taxes or fees to the CRTC, which can then be redistributed in the form of subsidies to various old media companies that feel they cannot compete without government help. But anyway, the point is, sorting out this new fees and subsidies regime took a lot of time, probably longer than the CRTC anticipated, and also introduced a lot of expectations of how the CRTC would go about implementing other aspects of Bill C-11. Accordingly, earlier this month, the CRTC unveiled a new revised timeline that dramatically scaled back expectations for just how soon they're going to be able to implement the full scope of the bill. Now, a lot of the delays are clearly motivated by a desire on the part of the CRTC to be more inclusive and accommodating. Government is under a lot of pressure these days to give everyone a chance to have their voices heard, especially historically marginalized communities. And during the previous hearings about the money stuff, there were concerns that the CRTC was perhaps ignoring the interests of certain groups. So, let me now walk you through the revised timeline. Up until July of this year, the CRTC will be focused on talking to representatives of the Indigenous Canadian community about how to best integrate their interests into Canadian media policy. Bill C-11 has the promotion of Aboriginal Canadian media as one of its stated goals, so they have to get that sorted out. Then, this summer, the priority will be consultations about closed captioning with representatives of the deaf community. Addressing the needs of disabled Canadians is another thing that's in Bill C-11. They have some other activities listed in here as well, but it seems like closed captioning is supposed to be the main focus of the summer. I don't really know how they figure they're going to be able to just breeze through strengthening the CRTC's commitment to official languages, given that any discussion involving the status of French in Canada tends to be very contentious and drawn out, but apparently that's the plan. Then, in the fall of 2024, the CRTC will do consultations on how to get more people to come to CRTC consultations, which I guess is fair enough. It is expensive to fly all of the way to Ottawa, and if the goal is inclusivity, it behooves the CRTC to make this process more affordable, since not every witness they'll want to hear from will be some rich YouTuber who can just jump on the first flight out of Vancouver. For the winter of 2024-2025, they will hold hearings on structural relationships to examine the relationships between small, medium, and large players in traditional broadcasting and online streaming. I don't know what that means exactly, but apparently it will take several months. And then, in the spring of 2025, a full year from now, they will finally get to the thing that everyone has been waiting for, which is the question of what sort of content counts as being Canadian enough to deserve a legally mandated promotion on online streaming platforms. They will also hold hearings on audio streaming services and the future of the Canadian news industry, to other things that Bill C-11 is nominally concerned with. In winter of 2025-2026, the timeline vaguely alludes to having some consultations on inclusion and diversity, which also seems a little flippant given the seriousness with which many people take that stuff. And then, around the same time, in what they describe as late 2025, the CRTC will begin Phase 3 of the Bill C-11 implementation process, in which they will focus on implementing the policy decisions listed above. Okay, so as a critic of Bill C-11, all of this is good news on a number of different fronts. For one, it means that if you are a Canadian YouTuber, or some other type of Canadian content creator, or just a Canadian who watches online video content, you can rest easy knowing that the algorithms and subscription feeds and all of the rest are not going to be changing anytime soon. The status quo is going to remain in place for at least a year. The government has chosen to put off the most difficult and controversial questions relating to Bill C-11's implementation, which is to say, deciding what sort of video content Canadians should be officially encouraged by their government to watch, for as long as possible. My guess would be that the CRTC understands that this is going to be a very difficult matter to adjudicate, and they don't want to rush into it. The hearings that they're planning to hold on this stuff in the spring of 2025 will doubtless be very intense and contentious, just because they will provide all sorts of fresh opportunities for all sorts of people to re-engage with all of the polarizing debates over censorship and propaganda and patriotism and nationalism that have defined Bill C-11 since the very beginning. I will do my best to be in the thick of it. Okay, but now here is the other huge reason why I'm feeling optimistic. The next Canadian general election is currently scheduled for October 27th, 2025. It was originally supposed to be on October 20th, but the government is amending the election law to push it a week later for reasons we are told have absolutely nothing to do with a drafting error in the previous law that accidentally made the parliamentary term a few days short and thus denied a bunch of politicians from meeting the qualifications for their government pensions. Now, all polling data currently suggests that Prime Minister Trudeau will lose his bid for a fourth term in a big landslide to Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. Pierre Poilievre, in turn, has repeatedly vowed to scrap Bill C-11 in its entirety at the earliest available opportunity.
That's why one of my first actions as Prime Minister will be to repeal C-11.
Hear, hear.
I will repeal the censorship law.
We will repeal the censorship laws, C-11. We will repeal the censorship law, C-11.
We will repeal the censorship law, C-11.
So if we go back to the timeline, you can see that this does not bode particularly well for the long-term future of C-11. Assuming Canada's political trend lines do not dramatically change in the next 17 months, Pierre is set to be elected Prime Minister shortly after the CRTC wraps up its hearings on Canadian content, but before the CRTC will have begun implementing whatever policy decisions come from those hearings. In other words, shortly after being sworn in, a future Prime Minister, Poilievre, would be able to step in and swiftly halt this whole bureaucratic process before it reaches its final form. He would be able to order the CRTC to halt its current proceedings and get Parliament to repeal Bill C-11 altogether, and thereby extinguish the CRTC's powers to even regulate online video content at all. So that remains the most likely outcome as far as the long-term future of Bill C-11 is concerned. The unexpected slowness of the CRTC, combined with the strength of the Conservative Party's poll numbers, align in a way that is incredibly favorable to critics of this bill. It is a perfect storm that gives me personally a lot of relief after several years of stress. Obviously, nothing is for sure. The popularity of the Conservatives could tank, or the CRTC could decide to put its foot on the gas and abruptly condense its timeline after expanding it, but those things seem like pretty big long shots. Things are looking good. So let me just close with a couple of words about what these latest revelations have taught me about the Canadian political process. I feel like I'm saying that a lot in these C-11 videos. Bill C-11 is a very flawed piece of legislation. It had a lot of ambition, but it was not very specific. So it just wound up delegating a lot of power and responsibility to the federal bureaucracy. The bill was also hugely controversial, which put a lot of pressure on the CRTC as a nonpartisan, professionalized regulatory body to implement the law cautiously and carefully with maximum public feedback. And this has resulted in what we are seeing now, where the passage of a law has become less consequential than it should have because the implementation stage has had to be so unavoidably long. So long, in fact, that it cannot be implemented without a legally required election intervening in which a new party is likely to be elected, whose popularity, in part, has been boosted by the controversy surrounding the law itself. So yeah, while no one can know exactly what the future holds for Bill C-11, the worries I once felt are starting to lessen quite a bit as this long-running drama starts to devolve from tragedy to farce, which is in turn symptomatic of some of the deeper problems with the way that this country is being governed in the late Trudeau era, but that is a topic for another day. Rest assured that if any other major developments happen on the C-11 front, I will be sure to share them with you, but for the time being, I think we're going to be waiting a while.